Hello and welcome to this short screencast on The Great Gatsby Chapter 2, a close analysis of the first paragraph of Chapter 2. But before we get to the text itself, our focus in this screencast is going to be on social context primarily, but also there's a really important bit of literary context that I want to make you aware of right from the off. And that is that very often students and teachers and critics are reminded when they encounter this section, which is about a place called the Valley of Ashes, they're reminded of a really famous poem by T.S. Eliot called The Wasteland. Now already, without even reading that poem, I'm sure you can see some sort of link, some sort of similarity between the idea of a valley of ashes, a valley of kind of grey dust, of deathly kind of grey dust, with the idea of a place called a wasteland, a land of waste. So this connection is really quite obvious and really quite significant, especially when you dig a little deeper and you find out that Fitzgerald was kind of massively inspired by T.S. Eliot. They were kind of contemporaries and kind of they were interested in each other's work. The Wasteland was published in 1922 and Fitzgerald began work on The Great Gatsby a year later, in 1923, and it was eventually published in 1925. So it's a really kind of convincing argument to suggest that Gatsby was inspired by The Wasteland and that perhaps this section on the Valley of Ashes is maybe his attempt to recreate that wasteland within his own work. It should go without saying, but I'd highly recommend you give The Wasteland a go. It's an incredibly complex poem, but for your purposes as a student of Gatsby, even if you just take on board a line or an image, we have here someone's tattoo with some images of lilacs out of the dead land, memory and desire stirring dull roots with spring rain. Just to capture a stanza like that, think about what it means, can really inform your understanding of perhaps of what Fitzgerald's trying to do here. But onto the text itself. It's a really short section we're looking at. It's followed by a really fascinating paragraph about Dr. T.J. Eckelberg and the ocular imagery, the imagery of eyes, the kind of fading, decaying advert for an optician's, which kind of pervades and oversees life in the Valley of Ashes. But we're not focusing on that here. We're looking at the very first paragraph because there's an awful lot to learn from this paragraph just on its own about the social context of Gatsby. So, I guess the first phrase to focus on here is the idea of the motor road hastily joining the railroad. A bit of kind of background here, the use of the railroad was favoured by the wealthy inhabitants here of West Egg. So the description of the motor road hastily joining the railroad suggests that the two roads are not in harmony. They're kind of awkward. It's an awkward join. It's kind of hasty. It wasn't thought through. It wasn't harmonious. And this perhaps symbolically highlights this kind of jarring difference between the Eggs, West and East Egg, and the Valley of Ashes. There's a real difference there. There's a real kind of awkwardness and contrast. Onto the phrase, the Valley of Ashes itself, I suggest here that this is certainly something of a juxtaposition. If you think about what's usually symbolised by the idea of a valley is something natural. It's a kind of natural part of a landscape. Usually you think of a valley in terms of it being quite surrounded by green hills, perhaps. But here we've got this natural image juxtaposed with something man-made, something industrial, something deathly, ashes, which suggests perhaps a spoiling of the landscape, a spoiling of nature. And this again might serve as some sort of social commentary. There's something unnatural maybe about the poverty and deprivation in this area when compared to the wealth and excess of the eggs, West Egg and East Egg. And again, remember that ashes directly symbolize death, so there's something deathly about this place. Next, we've got a couple of phrases which are both examples of alliteration. Got that repeated F sound, fantastic farm, repeated G sound, grotesque gardens. But also there's something ironic about these phrases too. So they're alliterative phrases, but they provide ironic, absurd images of the impoverished district described. There's nothing fantastic about this area in the conventional sense. It's not wonderful, it's not brilliant, it's not fantastic in that sense. But perhaps Nick's narration here serves to create a fantasy. There's something dark and fantastical about this place, something unreal, something exaggerated. Ashes continue as an extended metaphor throughout this section. The metaphor of ashes is sustained to the extent that in Nick's fantastical description, they are the grey, deathly building material used to create the poor quality housing. So you'll see how this idea of ashes just pervades this entire section. Moving on, we've got the use of a low frequency word here of transcendent. But again, there's something ironic about the way that Nick uses this word. To transcend, it's usually a really positive verb. Usually it's meant in the context of to rise above something and to almost get a kind of spiritual, a kind of more superior view of something if you transcend it. But here the men who are supposedly transcending are described as ash grey. They are described as moving dimly. Again, like ashes, they're perhaps deathly, their lives futile. Maybe they're already kind of dead, and maybe that's where the transcendence comes, that actually they're no longer living, they're just kind of ghosts, perhaps. I guess to an extent on that theme of ghostliness, we get this word invisible come up a bit later. This could be read in terms of social context and could be read metaphorically as well. It could be seen as a metaphor, because perhaps that word invisible reflects the sense that the valley is metaphorically invisible to the wealthy passengers who ignore this poverty on their landscape. To the wealthy passengers, the Valley of Ashes is just a place to go through. It's not a place to stop. It's not a place to live. It's just a place you have to go through to get from West Egg to East Egg, for instance. Finally, we've got a phrase which I'm going to describe as quite dehumanizing imagery. The ash grey men swarm up with leaden spades. Nick compounds his ghostly, deathly description of the rail workers by his use of the verb swarm. This word's usually reserved for talking about insects, a swarm of bees or animals. As such, his condescending tone towards the working class men is made clear, and we're perhaps reminded of his self-confessed snobbishness from chapter 1. As such, to what extent are we actually inclined to trust his judgments about people from different social backgrounds, if he is inclined to dehumanize them in this way? Okay, as with the other videos, I'm going to give you a few seconds on each of the slides here, showing the narrative features I've described along with their effects. Please do use the pause function to pause on these and take some notes, annotate your copy. That's the first one. And the second. And the third. And some final things for you to consider as you continue with your reading and your analysis. Why not trace Nick's description of working class characters throughout the novel? Look at how he deals with characters from other social classes, for the rest of the novel. And then extend this analysis. Think about how he describes characters of different racial or ethnic backgrounds. I'm thinking of the black passengers in the car that's described later on in the novel. We also have the Jewish character, Maya Wolfsheim. So look at the tone of his descriptions with these characters. Secondly, think about what the significance is of the fact that as readers, we learn about the Valley of Ashes, the place where they live, before we meet Myrtle and George Wilson. So we're given this as a context before we meet these characters, and maybe think about to what extent that makes us prejudge them. And thirdly, of course, I'm encouraging you to read Eliot's poem, but even if you don't, please do reflect on what the Valley of Ashes symbolises in terms of modern industry, modern technology, urban living, and of course, wealth. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you found this useful, and do look out for other screencasts coming soon. Thank you. Bye.